Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Q&A, so let's go ahead and knock this out. First question. Any risk in squatting and deadlifting on a surface that isn't completely solid, such as rubber gym flooring? Could this create possible instability issues like when squatting in running shoes with a cushioned sole? Well, that really depends on how squishy of rubber we're talking about. If it's hard rubber matting, actually that's really good because you get good traction. There's actually a much smaller chance of you slipping or having an issue like that. So actual hard rubber matting is a good thing. But if it's really squishy like the foamy stuff, yeah, in theory that could be a problem. When doing really heavy squats and deadlifts, having too much cushion or surface it can give can absolutely increase your chance of injury. It can cause potential issues with your joints. So actually, when you hear someone talking about squatting hurting their knees, there's actually sometimes I have to wonder what sort of surface they're squatting on. Maybe it's not hard enough, it's not firm enough, they're not on hard rubber or concrete, or maybe they're even like squatting in running shoes or tennis shoes that have a lot of cushion. And that could be contributing to some extent if they're doing way too much volume or workload and they're on that surface. Now, as far as an unstable surface, because there's a little more than having some give versus something being kind of unstable or uneven, yeah, doing these things on an uneven or unstable surface over time could be problematic. It could actually, again, injure you. This is why when you see people doing this squatting on Bosu balls or anything else, it's just absurd because the chances of falling and getting hurt are actually higher. But you can actually create uneven muscle balance from one side to the other because people who squat on an unstable surface will tend to oftentimes favor one side, or that will happen if they consistently squat on, like, again, a very unlevel floor or something, to where they squat the same direction or deadlift the same direction each time because it'll tend to favor one side. And yeah, they might get muscle imbalances in one of their legs, maybe their back to some extent. So it's not a good idea. Ideally, you want to squat and deadlift on a fairly level. It doesn't have to be perfectly level, but a fairly level surface that's very hard and has minimal give. Again, the most give you want is like the hard rubber matting on the floor, not the squishy stuff. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, next question. Hey Jason, we've all heard there are 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. How many calories are in a pound of muscle? How much protein is stored in a pound of muscle? Thanks. All right, first of all, it's important to remember that just because there's a certain amount of calories in something doesn't mean that that's the exact amount of deficit or surplus you need to create for that to happen, because humans are not 100% efficient with these things. It doesn't work on, again, we're not like a super efficient blast furnace. We're not super efficient stores where everything is done without any waste whatsoever, and that it always goes all purely to fat or muscle or whatever. So don't get those ideas stuck in your head, because those can be off a little bit. They can be skewed up to 20% easily. Now, as far as how much is in there, well, if you can look at other animals to determine this. Look at other mammals, because they have muscle composition that is virtually identical to humans. So what you could do, you could go look at a pound of really lean steak that's obviously still at the wet weight, the uncooked weight, and see what's in there. Again, one of the really, really lean ones, so that there's very, very little fat. It's almost all muscle. And you'll find that there's somewhere between like 105 up to maybe 115 grams of protein in a pound of muscle tissue. Now, a lot of people are going to freak out. They'll be like, well, that's not anywhere near a pound. Well, that's true, but you have to remember that muscles are primarily water. And even then, there's still water in there when you cook it down. There's connective tissue, there's tons of water, everything else, even when you cook that steak way down. So in terms of actual calorie holding tissues in there, approximately 110 grams, which is one reason I point out to people that gaining a pound of muscle only requires 110 grams, again, barring inefficiencies of the human body, but surplus protein to be accumulated. Well, you spread that out over a month, you're talking about something like 4 grams of extra protein a day, maybe 5 if you count for waste. At most 10. Okay, let's assume you're really inefficient. 10 extra grams of protein a day is sufficient to build a pound of muscle. So you've got that to factor in. And also, I think you're going to find the calories in a pound of muscle are surprisingly low. How much calories are in a really, really lean cut, ultra lean cut of steak or a pound of chicken breast? We're talking just over 400 at the most 450 calories. So it's a lot less than fat. So you can also see why, if your body taps into muscle tissue as a fuel source, because it needs extra glycogen or whatever's going on in starvation, you can see why you would lose muscle very quickly compared to body fat. Because again, that pound of body fat's got a massive energy store. It's intended to be energy store. It's got 3,500 calories in it. Whereas in that pound of muscle tissue has, the low 400s, at most 450 calories in it. That's not a whole lot. So you can see why you could lose muscle very quickly if your body starts burning it for fuel in a starvation situation. Okay, so let's move along to the next question. What are your thoughts on a late novice using exclusively the close grip on the bench press? I find that I can set myself up tighter, and it seems to improve my overhead press and dips as well. Keep up the good work, Jason. All right, that's a good question, and you're probably a bit new to my channel, or at least haven't been here for a few years. When I bench press, I tend to do exclusively close grip most of the year. The only time I bring it out at all from close grip historically is when I was getting ready for meets, and I wouldn't bring it out to actually a true wide grip. But yeah, I agree with you. I would love to see more people utilize the close grip as their primary chest press, and the reason for it is that you move the weight through a longer range of motion. It is harder, you can't use as much weight, but it will develop more overall strength. Also, because of the way the bar path has to go, look at your elbow position when you have to do a close grip, particularly if you go low on the chest. You'll notice that the bar path and the arc of it is going to simulate an overhead press quite a bit more than a flat bench will. So because you're training a motor pattern that's a little closer to your overhead press, you should find that it does in fact improve your overhead press quite a bit. And you'll notice that they also have more similar ranges of motion. So again, you're training that longer range of motion on the press from the chest, which is simply going to have a little better specificity of training in regards to the overhead press. So actually, yes, a close grip bench press should give slightly more carryover to your overhead press than a wider grip bench does. And so again, that's why you're probably noticing that trend. But in terms of actual strength development, shoulder health, and shoulder mobility, I think that doing the close grip instead of the wide grip bench press for most of the year, if not exclusively, is probably a much, much better choice. And I felt that way for a few years now, and I've always expressed that. All right, next question. Hey Jason, it sucks that you aren't powerlifting anymore, but I support your decision and get where you're coming from. I see that you're deadlifting heavy multiple times a week. What are you doing squat-wise to drive your deads up? Honestly, man, it doesn't really suck that I quit powerlifting. I feel like I'm just kind of free to train how I want and do things that I enjoy and focus upon just my size, strength, and fitness a lot more now that I'm not powerlifting and having to focus on the big three and maybe doing things I don't enjoy doing, like the flat bench and stuff like that. Even though, I mean, the flat bench is still an amazing exercise, I'm just not even doing it these days. I'm actually doing, for all my pressing, I'm doing push presses and dips exclusively at this point. So I'm kind of glad I'm not powerlifting. I don't have to deal with the competitive aspect, the competitive mindset, which in turn, I think when you're a competitor in something, I think it skews your mindset of the information that you put out for the general population, because you're coming from a different mentality, a different mindset. And I think oftentimes it can create a mentality that isn't going to help the average person get into shape much better. So in a lot of ways, I think for my audience, me quitting has been a good thing. Now, as far as the squats to go, I'm not squatting at all right now. I am doing exclusively push presses and deadlifts for my lower body, but I'm also doing those 3 times a week. So pretty much every time I train, I'm doing the push press and the deadlift. And the thing is, even doing those, because of the explosive nature of the push press as far as the leg drive goes, along with doing heavy deadlifts at a high frequency, my quad development has stayed exactly where it was when I was squatting 500 pounds. Like, I haven't seen any change in my leg development in any way other than my legs look a little leaner from the extra cardio I'm doing these days. But honestly, I haven't lost any leg development. I'm sure I've lost squat strength. It would probably take me, 6 months of squatting again hard to get back where I was. But at this point, I don't feel like I really need the squat for what I do. You guys got to remember, I got burned out squatting. I did squats up to 6 days a week to get to 500 pounds for competition a couple years ago. So I just feel burned out on the squat at this point. And I feel like the push press and the deadlift are actually handling my leg development and my thigh development just fine. And they'll give me all the explosive power that I need to do what I want to do for now. And eventually I might go back and do front squats. I started messing with them for just a short time and then quit. In the long term, I'll probably incorporate them again when I want to improve that element of my athleticism. But for now, I just don't feel like they're really necessary. All right, next question. I'm currently cutting, and though my bench and squat have gone down a bit, I feel as if I'm getting stronger on exercises that are less influenced by leverage change. Though I feel a bit more tired and not as able to grind out higher volume sessions, I'm still training hard and feel great. Is this whole cutting equals weak workouts mentality just that? A mentality and not always a reality? No, it's a physical reality depending on what you're doing. It's an issue of how hard are you cutting, how fast are you losing weight, how big of a calorie deficit are you in? Are you using a bunch of drugs to help you cut? And what's your workout volume and things look like? Also, the question of how lean you get. Again, if you're cutting fairly slow and you're above 10% body fat still, you'll probably stagnate if you're more advanced on your lifts. Some of your lifts might even regress a little bit, but they should all stay pretty reasonable. And that's how you do a reasonable cut, reasonable fat loss. But for guys who start getting a lot leaner, they start getting under 10% body fat, or you start losing weight fairly quickly, yeah, your workouts are going to suffer. You are definitely going to get weaker at that point. Unless, again, you're like some of these bodybuilders are doing who up their dose when they're cutting. That's a little different. Okay, you can up your dose and work around it. But guys who aren't going to do that, or particularly guys using no drugs, yeah, it is a real reality. But it seems like if you're okay on most of your stuff, you're a little tired. That's normal when you're losing fat. But if your lifts are staying good and a couple of them are going up, it's just you can't grind out the high volume workouts. It sounds like at this point, you're probably cutting at a pretty reasonable level. And I think that's the thing that you need to keep in mind with your workouts when you're trying to lose body fat. If you just auto-regulate and assess your workouts day to day, assess how you feel, and don't push yourself beyond the limits, and you cut at a reasonable rate, you're probably going to be okay. And it sounds like you're kind of doing that to some extent. So keep doing what you're doing, and if you start to get more and more lethargic or your workouts suffer and you become concerned about it, increase your calories a little bit. Maybe start doing some structured refeeds once a week. Do things to help offset that if you need to. That's what it comes down to, is just that self-regulation and realizing that if you're going to cut slowly and you regulate the volume of your workouts and you're not trying to get ultra ripped, you'll probably find that your strength will pretty well hold okay. You'll just get a little bit tireder than usual. It's just that when you push yourself beyond what you can recover from without the extra food, that's when you really run into problems, and that's when your workouts are going to suffer. But a lot of guys don't have this sense because they have this they get driven, they get obsessed sometimes, and they get stupid with it, and they no longer auto-regulate these things, and then they end up training themselves into the ground when they're cutting. So it just has to do with accumulated fatigue versus recovery. And if you regulate those and balance those two factors out, and you seem to be so far, you're probably going to be okay. All right, next question. I'm really into soccer and have been training like crazy for strength and technique. However, I'm wondering how my teammates who are a little smaller than me are on the same level of strength. And are there any tips you would recommend for growing stronger, but not necessarily bigger? All right, those guys are still going to get bigger. They're probably, if they add another 30 pounds to their squat, they're going to gain muscle mass from it. You don't get stronger without getting at least a little bit bigger. Now, here's the tip to it though. You can keep your body weight regulated by controlling your calories, meaning if you don't eat enough calories to gain weight, but you gain a little bit of strength, you will gain a little muscle, but you'll lose a little fat. You'll recomposition with it, and that will keep your overall body weight the same. Or in some cases, you could lose a little body fat and go down on the scale over time and still gain a little bit of muscle and gain strength. So that's what you need to factor in. Also, those guys, due to their training and stuff, might have better neural efficiency than you. They just are not genetically hold as much muscle mass as you do. Maybe they have lighter frames and you have a larger frame, so you're thinking they're smaller than you, but they've actually gained more muscle mass from their training than you have over time. So they're going to be a little stronger due to a little extra muscle, a little extra leverages, a little more neuromuscular efficiency. So what you can do personally to continue to get stronger is focus more on really low reps, build power, build strength on your big exercises with fairly low reps, and again, keep your diet in check. Don't overeat calories. And that way you'll be able to gain more strength without putting on body weight. And you'll gain, again, a little better neuromuscular efficiency, which will help you with your strength to weight ratios just a little bit more. So that's the advice I would give you in your situation. All right, next question. Recent studies are showing that the BMI associated with the lowest mortality rate is 27, putting it in the overweight category. If one was looking to be as healthy as possible, should they aim to be slightly overweight as long as they continue to lift and do cardio? Health greater than looks. No, that makes sense, and it's not because they're in the overweight category, it's because they've gained muscle mass. And like I've pointed out for you guys in the past, it's one thing to be in the overweight category, it's another thing to be in the obese category. If you go into the overweight category because you've put on 15 pounds of muscle mass by training for a couple of years, which is a lot, guys, and I always want to remind people, 20 to 30 pounds of muscle, depending upon your genetics, is going to determine where on that range you fall, is the absolute most lean muscle mass that you're going to put on in a lifetime without drugs. And anyone telling you otherwise is bullshitting you. They are absolutely full of shit. And if they've done it themselves, I promise you they're on drugs. Now, again, that's assuming you've already finished growing and you're not getting any taller. People who are getting taller, it's going to be a completely different set of numbers. If you started as a teen, it's different. Now, that being said, though, if you started at, say, 170 pounds, and over the course of your lifetime training, you put on 20 pounds of muscle mass and you lost 5 pounds of fat, well, you're going to end up, if you started at 170, at 185. Well, you've put on 15 pounds, and at a certain height, that might put you in the overweight category. But you're actually leaner than you started, so you're actually healthier in the sense of you stayed at a healthy body fat percentage in the athletic range, but you've put on muscle mass. Well, that's going to give you better nutrient partitioning. We know that muscle mass itself is protective against cancer and diabetes. We know that the data is pretty clear on that. So if you've put on 15 or 20 pounds of muscle through your lifetime of training, you're going to have a lower rate of cancer, like 50% lower, and you're going to have a lower rate of diabetes, up to 70 to 80% lower. Well, that's absolutely going to lower your mortality rate. Those are things that kill people. Those are two of the most common diseases that kill people. Heart disease being right behind it. Well, if you put on that kind of muscle mass and you've maintained your cardiovascular capacity on top of it because you do cardio, and it tends to go hand in hand. People who've gained muscle weight will tend to do cardio also. They're going to have lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's the whole lifestyle that's incorporated. Now, when you start getting into the obese category, it's a little different because it can put more strain on your heart, and you've probably gotten there with drugs. Meaning if you've lost body fat from where you started and you're at a healthy range and you're in the obese range, you're probably on anabolics and other drugs. And we don't know how much that's going to affect mortality entirely in the long term. It could raise mortality rates slightly. So that's a different animal, but there's a difference between being in the overweight. And the overweight category for people who lift and do cardio is not considered to be a risk factor. It's the obese range. And so the 27, I can absolutely see why that would happen, just because a pretty large segment of the lifting population is going to fall into that range. And therefore, that's going to skew the demographics. So that might be what's going on with the studies, if I had to guess. We need to look closer at those, though, and I'll look closer into those for you guys in the future. All right, next question. Jason, I've been eating fat-free refried beans lately on my cut because you recommended them a long-ass time ago. They have great macros. My only concern is that they have a high sodium content. Can you enlighten us on high sodium intake and give any recommendations, guidelines? Thanks, long-term fan. All right, first of all, you can get those oftentimes refried beans that are fat-free. You can also get them with reduced sodium, which could cut it up to 30 to 50%, depending on what's in there, which might be what you want to do. Now, as far as sodium intake and health risks go and water retention, it's entirely genetic. It appears that 2/3 of the population, roughly, are not really affected in terms of blood pressure and other health risks from sodium. But about 1/3 of people, around 30%, have a genetic predisposition towards water retention and elevated blood pressure from excessive sodium intake. So what I would recommend, if you want to know where you're at, do all your normal training and health, go on the higher sodium from the refried beans and go get your blood pressure tested. If you come back with high blood pressure or a risky blood pressure level, then you are probably in that category of people, assuming you're not doing any drugs or anything, you're doing regular cardio, you're not really overweight or anything. Yeah, you shouldn't have high blood pressure if you have a healthy lifestyle. So in your case, it's probably the sodium. So then come off of them, cut back to something normal like 2,000 or 2,500 milligrams of sodium a day, and then get your blood pressure tested again and see if that helps. And that should give you an idea if you're genetically predisposed to that or not. So it's a quick way for you to tell. It's not a perfect way to tell because there could be errors in there, but it's a good way to get a baseline idea. All right, next question. Jason, what could be a possible reason my IT band hurts after squatting? I've tried with and without all these shoes and still the same. Thanks for the content. No knee wraps or sleeves used. All right, I'm very glad that you mentioned no knee wraps or knee sleeves, because that was going to be one of the first things I was going to discuss, was going to be the risk from wearing those things in terms of long-term injury. So they're out. You have the same problem with Olympic shoes and flat-footed. So there's something else we need to look at this point. If you've been doing, foam rolling and all sorts of whatever else you can do to make this problem go away, and you're still getting inflammation in your IT bands. And for those who don't know, the IT band is the sheath of connective tissue that runs from the knee to the hip on the outside of your thigh, between your quad and your hamstring, right there along the side. And it does get inflamed sometimes. Now, if you're doing all these things and it's still getting inflamed, I'm going to recommend that you need to deload, or you need to look more closely at your program. It's probably not the shoes you're wearing. It's probably not your squat style that's causing it. It is very probably the fact that you could be overreaching at this point. You're inflaming the connective tissue from too much workload and volume on the squats, and it's time for you to start doing blocks of lower volume in your training, or even deload or incorporate the two. So I would start looking at what sort of periodization you're using, because I think if you're getting that inflammation regularly in the IT band from the squatting, you're probably doing too much volume and too much workload for you to recover from. And that's a warning sign to you that something is wrong there. So again, time to deload and time to start regulating that volume a little more closely. All right, next question. What's your thought on competitors that bench so much that they bench with a 2-inch range of motion and are still within the rules? It may be within the rules, but it just feels wrong. That's a good question. I'm going to answer it from two perspectives. I'm going to answer that from me as personally, and I'm going to answer it from me as a meat judge, because you guys know I was a WPC judge for a little while. All right, when I'm being a judge, I have to work within the rules. There are things that I can dislike and absolutely abhor in a lifter, that if they're within the rules, I'm going to judge them by the exact same standards that if they don't. I tend to judge rules by the actual book, and I don't deviate when I'm trying to be a meat judge. Now, there's a subjective nature trying to determine sometimes how far they moved something, or if a bar dipped, or they had some technical violation that you have to watch for. But if they do that and their butt stays on the bench, usually when I see someone doing a massive arch, particularly females, I get down on the floor so I can see what's going on to make sure that their butt doesn't lift off the bench, because that's usually the biggest thing that I watch for when they do that massive arch, because you'll see a lot of people do that. And if you don't watch close, you'll miss it when their ass comes an inch off the bench. So that's something you need to be very aware of. But outside of that, I allow it because the rules allow it, as long as their technique is within the rules. Just like with sumo deadlifts. I hate sumo deadlifts. I think they should be banned from powerlifting. I thought that for a long time, but I didn't judge them by any different standards because at this time the rule book says it's allowed. So I didn't penalize or judge them by any different standards because of it. I try to always be fair and within the rules. Now, that being said, do I personally like it? No, I think it's absurd. And would I recommend you do it outside of a competitive environment? Absolutely not. You're going to have a higher injury rate, and you're going to gain less overall strength from it. People who bench press a longer range of motion develop more strength that carries over to a playing field, more strength that'll carry over to a life and death situation, and they're going to have better shoulder health and shoulder mobility as a result of it. So I recommend people do as long of a bench press as they can, long range of motion, if their goal is to build strength and mobility and health. That's what I recommend. So I don't recommend this big arch with the ultra wide grip and everything they do anyways. I think it's absurd, and I think it has higher injury rates and it's less beneficial. However, you have to remember there's a difference between training for function and health and fitness versus training to win in a competitive environment. And that's the difference between the two. That's the difference of saying, hey, I'm going to train for strength versus I'm going to train for competitive powerlifting to win. It's the difference between training for I want to get bigger and leaner versus I want to compete in bodybuilding and win. You see that there's a difference there. There's a massive difference. And this is one of those exact examples of, are you training to win at a sport, or are you training for better performance and better fitness and better longevity? So that's the difference here. And you've got to look at it from both those perspectives. All right, next question and last question of the week, and this one's going to be off topic, and I decided to cover it because it's kind of related to kind of my firearm stuff. And for those of you who don't know, I do have a Facebook fan page for my firearm channel, and I actually have a firearm page. You can find links for it everywhere. So let's go ahead and get to that question. Will your stance on gun-free areas prevent you from ever going on vacations in or outside the U.S. by airplane, considering airports and airlines are gun-free zones? All right, those of you who watch my other stuff know that my stance changed on this. This was a big factor in me returning to the United States and returning to Texas after living abroad. That was actually the fact that I felt like living in a country to where I was disarmed, particularly as someone who's out there on the internet who was dealing with real world stalkers, made me realize that I needed to be armed again and return to that aspect of my life, which is a massive part of my childhood, my early adulthood growing up. Firearms were a massive part of my upbringing and culture. In fact, to the point to where they were an everyday thing for me for many, many years. And I kind of left that behind, particularly once I went to the UK, but I realized that was a problem for me personally that I couldn't live with. And politically, I think we're in a period in the US to where it is a big deal now. So as far as answering your question, I will not travel to a place to where I cannot be armed, because they're not providing security. Now, if someone wants to provide a full armed security detail for me, that would be different, but they're not. I'm not a big enough or important enough person that anyone's going to give me 5 Secret Service agents or 5 bodyguards or something to make sure that I'm going to be okay. So it's up to me to provide my own security. And that means I'm not going to a place where I can't be armed. Now, the difference is if I go to certain events that I know have full security, it's different. Like I went to a football game last year. But the difference with that football game is when you go in there, there's a SWAT team on the roof with snipers up there at football games here, for people who don't know that. In fact, they're like that in a lot of your countries. You're just not aware of it. They don't tell you. We had over 100 armed police officers in the building. They have metal detectors, and you have security everywhere. The entire parking lot, from the time you park to the time you go in and get back to your car, you're never going to be out of eyesight of armed police officers who are there to stop any physical conflicts immediately. So anyone who even gets in a fist fight or attacks someone is absolutely going to prison. And in Texas, they're probably going to get slapped with a felony for that. They could do up to 5 years for that. So it's a very safe environment to go to certain sporting events. Same thing with airports. And airports are not gun-free zones, by the way. I don't know where you got that idea. Airports, you can absolutely carry your firearms. You just can't wear them. You can transport them. There are many places in the U.S. I could take one of my handguns, and I could take one of my AR-15 rifles and take them on the plane and check them in baggage. There are special rules that you have to follow for bringing your guns and ammo, and you need to look into those, but they're absolutely allowed on airplanes. You can absolutely put them in your luggage and carry them with you anywhere you travel within the United States, as long as you don't enter certain cities like Washington, D.C., places like that. There are a few exceptions, but as long as those weapons themselves are not illegal in the city you're flying to, it's perfectly acceptable to check them in. And the same thing, you're going to have armed security and metal detectors everywhere. So it's not like you're in danger of being attacked. So no, airports and certain sporting events are a little different, because again, you're unlikely to be singled out as an individual just traveling to those things, and you have security everywhere. But for me personally, anywhere to where I don't have that available, I'm simply not going to ever be unarmed again. It's just something I refuse to do. So as far as leaving the U.S. for vacations, yeah, I just don't see that happening in the future. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.